One thing that bothers me about electronic resources is that they tend to be terribly ephemeral. You'll notice behind me, I have lots and lots of books, about 2,000 in my office here. And the advantage of books is that it took authors a long time to write them, and they thought deeply about what they were writing. And then, at least in times past, they had good editors at scientific publishers for my area of expertise and interest. And so they generally came out pretty well and pretty useful, and useful over a long period. I have not terribly been happy with trying to rely on web resources because they get changed or disappear far too easily. You can have someone who has a very nice page at their, say, university department website, and then they move on to a new job in a different field or a different location, or they retire, or they pass on, and management turns off their home directories and destroys the website. If you're lucky, this might have been recorded in the Wayback Machine. That's archive.org. But often it isn't. So it makes it rather hard to cite these things. And of course, publishers have also been not terribly keen on the idea of having web citations in serious publications, again, because they can't be relied on. The Digital Object Identifier System, the DOI system, attempts to put a permanent handle on a document so that if a journal, for example, is sold from one publisher to another, the website may change, but the DOI is a permanent handle and will still get you to wherever that article is today. So that's certainly helpful for refereed published articles in journals, and also many publishers now assign DOIs to their books. But for almost everything else on the web, I guess perhaps it's because I'm old now, but I'm really bothered by people trying to rely on such resources just because I don't think they'll be here next week or next month or next year. I've had a little side activity the past month or so. A member of our community, it turns out, died a year ago, and we're trying to find out exactly what happened to him. There is a Wikipedia article about him, and people in our little communications group are finding that they'll make a change on that Wikipedia page, and within a few days, the change is deleted or revised. So with something that anybody can edit, it's very difficult to build up reliable information. So that's all I have to say there.
A quick question: how reliable are DOIs? Does something with a DOI, how to what extent can one really depend on it being permanent, or have some DOIs become unavailable over the years?
Well, the intent certainly is that it is a permanent handle that should exist for centuries into the future. Now, what it can do is bring you to a site that has that document. Journals, for example, are regularly sold from one publisher to another. The second issue is that once you've arrived at that site, can you get the article? And that often is a totally separate question.
You mean due to access restrictions and so on?
Yeah, if the journal was, for example, only in printed form, they may no longer have printed copies. If it's in electronic form, they may decide that they will make it available to you at a rather high price that you perhaps can't afford. This is particularly an issue for people in the second and third worlds, where the cost of a typical scientific article from European and American publishers is $50 to $100 for an article that might be 5 or 10 pages long. Well, that amount of money is more than a month's gross salary in many countries on the planet. So access is a problem, but that's an independent issue from the DOI system itself, which really does intend to supply a permanent location, and ideally a relatively short handle as well. If you traverse the web at various publisher sites, you'll discover they have widely varying practices about web URLs. Cambridge University Press, for example, tends to take the entire title of an article and turn it into a very long string in the URL, and then they attach some random numbers at the end of it. without those magic numbers and that very long string, you can't use the URL. Fortunately, with the DOI system, publishers are encouraged to be relatively brief, so that they tend to be fairly modest. And the notion is that it could become routine practice, and is becoming routine practice now, to have DOI colon 10 dot something at the end of a literature reference in a bibliography. Now, this, of course, presumes that the reader of that article knows what DOI colon means. And certainly there are plenty of people in the general public who have no idea at all. But most people today, no matter where they are, because of exposure to the internet, know what a URL looks like. So when you see http:// they know they can type that into a search engine and arrive there. Unfortunately, the search engines are not DOI aware. So if you type a bare DOI into a search engine, you're unlikely to get anything. If you put DOI colon in front of it, you might. What you should do is put a web prefix that looks like doi.org/10 dot something. And then that will actually resolve to a web address and will get you to the article.
I feel as though we might have moved a little bit away from helping beginners. And if nobody wants to, I'd like to talk about that, and I'd like to hear suggestions about that, or even I find it too difficult because.
Well, I raised the point of the ephemerality of web resources, particularly with respect to this question of advice for beginners, because if we point people to websites, that may work today, but I'm afraid it's far too often the case that within a few weeks or months or a year or two, it won't work anymore. And so all of our work that's been put into pointing people to these things and recording their locations and so on may be completely wasted. Whereas formal publications in the forms of books and journals tend to be much more reliable. So I have on my shelves a great many books about tech and LaTeX and Metafont, and I rely fairly heavily on them.
I think it's a real problem, and it's a community problem, and I don't see any way of solving it within 3 months, making a contribution that helps within 3 months. It can help with the, the curation of resources, to say, well, one thing that might help beginners is a place to go for broken links. What do I do if I've got a broken link for help pages? So what do I do when a help page link is broken?
Yes, and archive.org will help there. And they do crawl sites, but I've looked at their site for web pages in my department, and I find sometimes the intervals of crawling are months apart. And so for rapidly changing documents, that may not be fine-grained enough. And I'm not aware of any other major resource that tracks these things.
Okay, so what do I do when a help page link is broken? It sounds like a beginner won't know about the archive.org. Having a place where broken link, that would simultaneously be a place where broken links are reported. Yeah. This is a place to report broken links. Okay, so off the top of my head and following on what Nelson said, and thinking about lightweight infrastructure, have a GitHub repository that's fairly permanent with an issue tracker for reporting broken links.
Is there a GitHub client for every system which runs tech?
Sorry?
Is there a GitHub client for every system which can run LaTeX?
I didn't understand your question. Is there a GitHub
Client.
client?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. You just need
in the back.
web browser. You just use the web browser.
Okay,
For,
so at that level, you can access anything if you have it in a browser.
yeah, I mean, if you use the issue tracker, it's just a web browser.
Okay,
You can't. Now I understand the question. It's a good question.
but GitHub can be used for other things as well, where you need a client if you're doing
Oh yeah,
software reservation, things like that.
yeah. If you're doing more than very lightweight work on repositories, you need a Git client on your machine.
Right.
But if you're doing very light work on repositories, you can actually do it through the web browser.
Okay, yeah, then that's not an issue.
Yeah. So, and I think the great benefit of that is most people have a GitHub account, or many people have a GitHub account. So there's no question of people having to sign up. They're already signed up.
Most people.
Well, when I say most people, I don't mean like Facebook. I mean like most geeks.
Most.
I mean, I know geeks are a subclass, very small subset of people, but many tech users. Let me roll back. Many tech users, quite a few tech users, enough to make it worthwhile. Use GitHub. So having a GitHub repository where you can report broken links and faulty information. So this is not the same as Stack Exchange. How does it distinguish itself from Stack Exchange? It's about curating content. It's sort of a bit
Jonathan, I have
meta.
a
Kelly wants
question.
to.
Yeah.
Sure.
So